My name is Emily. I am a woman who spent 40 years balancing the books of others, never once imagining that the most difficult audit I would ever perform would be the one of my own heart. I have known the warmth of a life well built, and I have felt the cold, sharp sting of a betrayal that tried to turn me into a ghost in my own home. Before I share the account of the night my world crumbled, and the morning I rebuilt it with steel, I want to pause and offer a humble thank you. To you, the person listening right now. Thank you for lending me your time and your heart. In a world that often rushes past the quiet struggles of the broken, your presence here is a precious gift that I do not take for granted. If this story touches a place within you that understands the weight of sacrifice and the necessity of strength, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. We are a community of those who refuse to be erased. To those of you who have already joined this circle and hit that subscribe button, I offer you my deepest gratitude and a sincere blessing. May your lives be graced with an abundance of wealth that overflows, and may your homes be so filled with a radiant, unshakable happiness that no shadow of sorrow can ever find its way inside. Now let us walk back to that night. The air inside the church was heavy, chilled by the hum of the air conditioning and perfumed with lilies that seemed almost suffocating. The air inside the Grace Chapel did not merely circulate, it stagnated, heavy with the cloying sepulchral perfume of 1,000 white lilies. To the mourners filing past the pews, the scent likely represented purity or the sweetness of a life well lived. To me it was a shroud, a thick floral veil that threatened to choke the very breath from my lungs. Every inhalation felt like swallowing velvet, soft yet suffocating. I stood at the precipice of the mahogany casket, my fingers trembling as they traced the cold, polished grain of the wood. Beneath that lid lay Henry, my anchor, my quiet confidant, the man who had spent 40 years whispering, "We'll figure it out," into the crook of my neck whenever the world turned gray. Now the world wasn't just gray. It was monochromatic, drained of every hue that made life worth the labor. His face, stilled by the mortician's art, looked like a waxen effigy of the man I loved. The rugged lines earned from years of honest carpentry had been smoothed away, leaving behind a stranger who didn't know the secret language of my sighs. "You're doing so well, Emily," a neighbor murmured, patting my hand with a sympathy that felt like sandpaper. I nodded mechanically, my lips stretched into a thin, practiced line of gratitude. But my soul wasn't there. It was hovering somewhere near the vaulted ceiling, looking down at the hollow shell of a woman dressed in black wool. My eyes, sharpened by decades of auditing balance sheets and reconciling disparate figures, drifted toward the back of the room. There, framed by the jagged shadows of a stained-glass apostle, stood my son Chase. He wasn't alone. Talia, his wife, stood beside him, her hand draped over his arm, not in support, but in a gesture that looked suspiciously like possession. I had raised Chase to be a man of character. I had spent his childhood teaching him that a man's worth was found in his word and the calluses on his hands. But as I watched them, a cold, visceral dread began to pool in my stomach. Their heads were bowed, yes, but not in prayer. They were leaning into one another, their lips moving in the rapid staccato rhythm of a business negotiation. I leaned back slightly, pressing my spine against the hard edge of the front pew, and strained to hear past the soft weeping of Henry's sister. "Equity is at an all-time high in this zip code," Chase whispered. His voice, usually a warm baritone that reminded me so much of Henry's, was now stripped of its music. It was the voice of a man reading a ticker tape. "We'll have to act fast," Talia replied, her eyes darting toward the casket before returning to Chase's face. "Modern buyers won't look twice at that 1990s wallpaper. If we do granite in the kitchen and stainless steel throughout, we can flip it by the summer. It's a gold mine, Chase. A literal gold mine." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Equity. Granite. Flip. They weren't discussing the man who had taught Chase how to cast a fishing line. They weren't mourning the grandfather who had built dollhouses and bird feeders in the garage until his fingers were too arthritic to hold a chisel. They were dissecting his corpse before it was even in the ground, stripping the meat of his life's work from the bone of his memory. I looked down at the funeral program gripped in my hands. The ink was black and final, in loving memory of Henry David Hollowell. Below it, a verse about eternal rest. I felt a sudden fierce urge to scream, to shatter the stained glass and drown out their mercenary whispers with the raw, jagged sound of my grief. Henry and I had bought that house when the neighborhood was nothing but dirt roads and dreams. We had skipped vacations for a decade to pay down the principal. We had lived on lentil soup and second-hand clothes, so that Chase could go to a university that didn't leave him drowning in debt. Every shingle on that roof was a story of sacrifice. Every floorboard was polished with the sweat of a man who believed that a home was a sanctuary, not an asset. I looked back at Chase. For a fleeting second he caught my gaze. I expected a flash of shame, a softening of his features, a momentary return of the boy who used to bring me wilted dandelions when I was sad. Instead, I saw a flicker of impatience. He looked at me the way an heir looks at a lingering obstacle, a line item on a ledger that refused to balance. "The market is fickle, Talia," Chase muttered, turning his back to me. "We can't afford to let it sit. It's our future. Dad would have wanted us to be smart about this. Dad would have wanted." The audacity of the lie made my blood run cold. Henry would have burned that house to the ground before he let it become a source of contention. He would have given the shirt off his back to his son, but he would have expected that son to honor his mother's peace. As the organist began the recessional hymn, a low, mournful rendition of "Abide with Me," the congregation began to rise. The service was over. The social ritual of death was moving toward its final act at the graveside. Chase stepped forward then, taking my elbow. His grip was firm, performing the role of the grieving son for the benefit of the watching crowd. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Let's get you home. You need to rest. We'll take care of everything." The word everything felt like a threat. "I'm fine, Chase," I said, my voice sounding brittle even to my own ears. "You're in shock," Talia added, sliding to my other side. Her perfume was sharp, citrusy, and entirely out of place in a room filled with lilies. "It's a lot to process. But don't worry. Chase and I have a plan. We've already started looking into the logistics. You won't have to lift a finger." I allowed them to lead me down the aisle, my black heels clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. It sounded like a countdown. With every step away from Henry's casket, I felt the world I knew dissolving. The first crack in the foundation of my life hadn't occurred when Henry's heart stopped beating. It happened right here, under the watchful eyes of stone saints, as I realized that the son I had nurtured was a stranger wearing my child's face. Outside, the sun was blindingly bright, an insult to the darkness in my chest. As I was ushered into the back of the black town car, I looked up at the house on the hill, our house. The white shutters were closed, looking like blind eyes. I was an accountant. I knew how to read the signs of a looming deficit. I knew when a partnership was no longer solvent. And as the car door closed with a heavy, muffled thud, I knew that the funeral wasn't the end of my mourning. It was merely the opening of a much darker account. Chase sat in the front seat, already pulling out his phone, his thumb scrolling through real estate listings before we had even cleared the cemetery gates. He thought I was broken. He thought grief had turned my brain to ash and my heart to lead. He didn't know that beneath the black lace and the widow's tears, the auditor in me was already beginning to count the cost of his betrayal. Tomorrow they would come for the keys. Tomorrow they would try to erase the woman who made the home possible. But as I watched the cemetery disappear in the rearview mirror, I made a silent vow to the man in the mahogany box. "They can take my peace, Henry, but they will never take the note." The house Henry and I had built, brick by labored brick, sacrifice by quiet sacrifice, felt suddenly violently alien. The air, which had for decades carried the scent of beeswax polish and Henry's cedarwood tobacco, was now thick with the cloying odor of sympathy. It was the scent of 100 foil-wrapped casseroles cooling on the granite island, their steam condensing into salty droplets that looked like tears on the stone. By 9 o'clock, the last of the neighbors had trickled out, their whispers of "call if you need anything" echoing hollowly in the foyer. I stood in the kitchen, my hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater, staring out the window at the oak tree Henry had planted the day we signed the deed. It was a skeleton now, its winter branches clawing at a bruised purple sky. I expected the silence to be a sanctuary, a space where I could finally let the first real sob break through the iron wall of my composure. But the silence didn't last long enough to be holy. I heard the heavy thud of boots on the hardwood, a sound too aggressive for a house in mourning. Chase walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened like a noose around his neck, followed closely by Talia. She was already holding a notepad, her eyes scanning the crown molding with a clinical, predatory intensity. "Mom," Chase began. The word, which used to be a soft landing, now sounded like a summons. "We need to talk about the transition. We've been looking at the numbers. This place. It's a lot of house for one person. Especially a person who's going to be on a fixed income now." I didn't turn around. I kept my hands in the water, feeling the wedding band on my finger, the gold worn thin from 40 years of life. "It's my home, Chase. It's where your father's ghost lives. It's where I intend to stay." "Don't be sentimental, Emily," Talia snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a serrated blade. "Sentiment doesn't pay the property taxes. Chase is the only heir. It only makes sense for us to move in now, to start the renovations while the market is hot. You can find a nice assisted living suite, somewhere with a social calendar." I turned then, my wet hands dripping onto the floor we had polished together only a month ago. "Assisted living? I am 64 years old, Talia. I am a licensed accountant. My mind is sharper than your ambition. This house is paid for. It is mine." Chase stepped into my personal space, his face flushed with a dark, mercurial anger I hadn't seen since his teenage tantrums. But this wasn't the rage of a child. It was the entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him a shortcut. "Yours? Dad worked himself into an early grave for this place. It's my inheritance. You're just a steward who's overstayed her welcome." "I am his wife," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rising fury. "I am the woman who saved the pennies so he could buy the lumber. I am the one who—" The air was suddenly displaced. A sharp, stinging crack reverberated through the kitchen, a sound so loud it seemed to shatter the very atmosphere. My head snapped to the side. For a heartbeat there was no pain, only a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. Then the heat arrived. A searing, white-hot bloom of fire spread across my left cheek, a visceral brand of betrayal that felt like it was melting the very marrow of my bones. My knees buckled, the world tilting on its axis, and I gripped the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned ghost white. I stayed like that, bent over, my hair shielding my face, listening to the ragged sound of my own breath. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a massacre. "Get out," Chase bellowed. The sound didn't come from his throat. It came from a place of hollowed-out cruelty. "Get out. This was never your home. It's ours now, and you're just in the way." I looked up, my vision blurred by a single hot tear that refused to fall. Behind him, Talia stood with her arms folded, her expression one of mild boredom, as if she were watching a tedious legal proceeding. "He's right, you know," she said, her voice a poisonous silk. "You're nothing here but dead weight, Emily. You're the clutter we need to clear out before we can start the real work." Dead weight. The words were more agonizing than the slap. In their eyes, I wasn't the mother who had nursed Chase through pneumonia. I wasn't the woman who had balanced their books and bailed them out of failed business ventures. I was a liability, a line item to be erased, an old, useless ledger to be tossed into the fire. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. A strange, icy calm began to settle over me, the kind of calm that comes to an auditor when they find the missing million. I realized, with a clarity that felt like a jagged diamond, that my son was gone. The boy I loved had been consumed by this monster of greed. "I see," I said. My voice was low, steady, a terrifying contrast to his shouting. I stood up straight, ignoring the throbbing pulse in my cheek. I walked past them, my shoulder brushing Chase's arm. He recoiled slightly, perhaps surprised by the lack of hysterics. I went to the master bedroom, the room where I had held Henry's hand as he took his last breath, and pulled a single battered suitcase from the closet. What do you take when your life is being liquidated? I took my laptop. I took my leather-bound ledger. I took the small velvet box that held my mother's pearls. I didn't take the photos. I didn't take the heirlooms. They were just objects, and currently, they were tainted by the shadows of the people in my kitchen. I packed with a mechanical, rhythmic precision. Every fold of a sweater was a heartbeat. Every click of a latch was a door closing on my heart. When I walked back through the kitchen, Chase and Talia were already opening the cabinets, discussing which walls to knock down. They didn't even look up. To them, I was already a ghost. I walked out the front door. the heavy oak swinging shut behind me with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. The night air was biting, a cold slap to match the one on my face. I stood on the porch for a moment, the weight of the suitcase pulling at my shoulder. I looked up at the porch light. It was flickering, the bulb dying, casting a rhythmic, stuttering yellow glow over the driveway. It looked like a failing pulse. "This was never your home," he had said. As I climbed into my car and turned the key, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The red mark on my cheek was darkening, a map of my son's shame. I put the car in reverse, the gravel crunching beneath my tires like breaking bone. They thought they had one. They thought the house was the prize. But they had forgotten one crucial detail, the same detail that had made me the most successful accountant in the county. They had the keys, but I had the note. And in the world of ledgers and law, the person who holds the note holds the world. As I drove away, leaving the flickering light of my life behind me, I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended at the funeral. This was now a season of auditing. And by the time I was finished, Chase and Talia would realize that the dead weight they had discarded was the only thing keeping the roof over their heads. The Starlight Motel sat on the bruised outskirts of town, a place where the asphalt was cracked like old skin and the air tasted of exhaust and neglect. Checking in felt like a final, humiliating descent into a life I didn't recognize. The clerk behind the plexiglass didn't look at my face. He only saw the credit card I slid through the tray, a card Chase thought he had rights to, but one that was tied to an account he couldn't touch. Not yet. The room smelled of an aggressive, industrial bleach that stung the back of my throat, an olfactory attempt to scrub away the lingering ghosts of 1,000 forgotten travelers. The carpet was a weary shade of brown, worn thin by the pacing feet of people with nowhere else to go. I set my single suitcase on the bed, the springs groaning in protest, and sat down. Outside, a pink neon sign buzzed with a jagged, restless electricity. Every few seconds it would flicker, casting a rhythmic magenta stutter across the thin polyester curtains. Buzz-click, buzz-click. It was a frantic artificial heartbeat that matched the tremor in my hands. I reached up, my fingers ghosting over my left cheek. The skin was tight, hot and swollen. A map of my son's cruelty etched in violet and crimson. In the quiet of that sterile room, the numbness finally began to fracture. For hours I had been a machine, packing, driving, surviving. But now, in the hollow of the night, the weight of Henry's absence and Chase's violence converged. I felt a sob rise in my chest, a wild, jagged thing that threatened to tear me open. But I swallowed it. I forced it back down into the dark corners of my soul where I kept my most difficult ledgers. Tears were a luxury of the protected. I was no longer protected. I lay back on the scratchy bedspread, staring at the ceiling where a water stain bloomed like a dark flower. I watched the clock on the bedside table. 2:14 a.m., 2:45 a.m. The world outside was silent, save for the occasional hiss of a passing car on the wet highway. At exactly 3:07 a.m. I sat up. The grief was still there, a heavy, suffocating shroud, but the accountant in me, the woman who had reconciled millions for the most demanding firms in the state, woke up. I didn't reach for a Bible. I didn't reach for a bottle of pills. I reached for my phone. The screen illuminated my face with a cold, clinical blue light. My thumb hovered over the banking app, the gateway to the digital fortress Henry, and I had built over 40 years. With a steady breath I logged in. The numbers flickered to life, glowing like small digital beacons of truth. My eyes skipped past the checking balances and the savings yields, moving straight to the heart of the matter. The mortgage and the home equity line of credit, HELOC. I scrolled through the primary loan documents, my eyes narrowing as I scanned the fine print of the digital deed. There it was, sitting on the page like a sentinel of justice. Borrowers, Henry D. Hollowell and M&A Hollowell. My name. My legal identity. I moved to the ownership history, checking for any riders, any secondary names, any quitclaim deeds that might have been filed in the fog of Henry's illness. There were none. Chase's name appeared nowhere. He was an occupant, a beneficiary in a future that had not yet arrived, but in the eyes of the bank, he was a ghost. A cold, sharp thrill of clarity pierced through my numbness. My years in the industry had taught me one immutable truth. People are volatile. They lie to themselves, they betray their blood, they rewrite history to fit their greed. But numbers? Numbers are honest. They don't have egos. They don't have tantrums. They simply are. I looked at the autopay settings. Every month for 26 years, the mortgage had been deducted from my personal checking account, the account where my salary and Henry's pension were commingled. I had been the one feeding the beast. I had been the one ensuring the roof stayed over our heads while Chase was out losing money on startup ideas and luxury cars he couldn't afford. Then I opened the Helic, the gold mine Talia was so eager to strip. The balance was zero. We had never touched it. We believed in owning things outright, in the dignity of a debt-free life. But the line of credit was open and it was substantial. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential equity sat there, ripe for the taking. Chase and Talia believed they were the new masters of the manor. They were likely in my kitchen right now, drinking my wine and sketching out floor plans on my table. They thought that because Henry was gone, I was a conquered territory. They saw a grieving widow, a dead weight, they could discard like an old sofa. They didn't see the note holder. I took screenshots of everything. Every balance, every history line, every confirmation number. I felt the auditor's mind taking over, the part of me that could find a discrepancy in a 10,000-page report. I began to categorize the information in my head, building a case not out of emotion, but out of ironclad financial reality. I looked at the borrower of record status. By law, as the surviving borrower, I held the reins. I was the only one authorized to draw from that equity. I was the only one who could authorize a sale. I was the only one the bank would listen to. Chase had the keys. He had the physical walls. He had the arrogance of the young. But I had the paper. I leaned my head against the cold, vibrating wall of the motel room, listening to the neon sign outside. Buzz click. Buzz click. The pink light bled through the curtains, staining my hands the color of a sunset. You were wrong, Chase, I whispered into the empty room. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as steady as a heartbeat. It was never your home. It was mine. And you just gave me the reason to prove it. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours between 3 a.m. and dawn drafting a digital ledger of every threat, every cent I had spent on his debts over the years, and every sacrifice Henry and I had made. By the time the first gray hints of light began to filter through the smog of the highway, my resolve had crystallized into something harder than granite. I wasn't just going back from my house. I was going back to show them what happens when you try to audit a woman who has nothing left to lose but her dignity. I closed the app and set the phone on the nightstand. The pink neon sign finally flickered one last time and died as the morning took over. I stood up, walked to the small cracked mirror above the dresser, and looked at the woman staring back. The bruise was darker now, a deep angry plum. It was the only thing on me that looked broken. My eyes, however, were wide, clear, and focused. I hold the note, Henry, I told the reflection, and today I'm calling it in. The morning light was an intruder. It spilled across the polished wooden tables of the copper cup with an unforgiving brilliance, a golden mockery of the darkness that had settled into the marrow of my bones. In this corner of Dilworth, the world was waking up with a cheerful, caffeinated efficiency. Young professionals in tailored wool tapped away at sleek laptops, their faces illuminated by the glow of rising stocks and social notifications. Mothers in athletic wear compared strollers, their laughter chiming like silver bells against the low hum of the espresso machine. To them, I was merely a silver-haired widow in black slacks, a quiet fixture of the morning rush. They didn't see the bruise beneath my foundation, nor did they hear the scream echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. I felt exposed, as if the sun were a spotlight shining on my failure as a mother, on the fact that I had raised a son who could strike the woman who gave him life and then demand her shelter. I sat at a corner table, tucked away from the draft of the door, and placed Henry's worn leather folder on the wood. It was more than a collection of papers, it was a reliquary. The leather was scuffed at the edges, darkened by the oils of Henry's hands over decades of Saturday morning office hours at our kitchen table. It smelled faintly of cedar and the vanilla scent of old bond paper. This folder held the architecture of our existence. One by one I laid out my weapons. First, the marriage certificate, a testament to 40 years of a partnership that was never 50-50, but always 100% from both sides. Then the death certificate, the ink still fresh enough to feel like a wound. And finally, the mortgage statements. 26 years of monthly entries. a rhythmic pulse of financial discipline that proved we had never been late, never been reckless. These were not just documents. They were the iron bars of the fortress I was about to rebuild. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, but as my gaze fell upon the borrower of record line on the statement, the tremor died. The fear that had hollowed me out in that bleach-scented motel room began to change state. It was no longer a gas, volatile and overwhelming. It was calcifying into a cold, brilliant resolve. I was an accountant. I understood the power of the ledger. In the world of commerce, sentiment was a ghost, but the note was God. I dialed the branch. After the sterile maze of automated prompts, a calm, professional male voice answered. "This is Carter, branch manager. How can I help you today?" I took a breath, drawing in the scent of roasted beans and the oblivious joy of the cafe. When I spoke, my voice wasn't the voice of the woman who had cowered on her kitchen floor. It was a blade of polished glass, sharp, clear, and perfectly balanced. "Mr. Carter, this is Na Hollowell. I am the surviving borrower on the mortgage for the property at 422 Briarwood Lane." I paused, allowing the weight of my name to settle into the bank system. I could almost hear the quiet clicking of keys on his end. "Yes, Mrs. Hollowell. I see the account here. I'm very sorry for your loss. We received the notification regarding Henry." "Thank you," I said, my tone clipped and professional. "However, I'm calling because there is a residency and occupancy dispute concerning the property. There has also been what I believe to be a case of elder abuse and attempted financial coercion. I need to place an immediate administrative hold on the account." The silence on the other end was instantaneous. In the banking world, dispute is a red flag, but elder abuse is a siren. "I understand," Carter said, his voice tightening with a new level of seriousness. "Mrs. Hollowell, as a named borrower, you have the right to request a review. What exactly are you looking to do?" "I want the autopay for the primary mortgage canceled immediately," I stated, my eyes fixed on the marriage certificate. "I will be making the payments manually from a separate, private account to ensure there is no commingling of funds with the unauthorized occupants. Furthermore, I request a total suspension of all draws on the home equity line of credit. I want the system flagged so that no one, regardless of what they claim, can access that equity without my physical presence and my signature. I also require a property inspection to document the current state of the collateral." "That is a significant request, Mrs. Hollowell," Carter noted. "Especially the Hellick freeze. We will need to verify identity and occupancy status. I have the death certificate, my identification, and the mortgage note in front of me," I countered. "I can be at your office in 20 minutes. I am also prepared to file a formal report regarding the unauthorized entry into the home. I am the borrower, Mr. Carter. The bank's contract is with me, not with my son's sense of entitlement." As I spoke, I watched a young man at the next table laugh into his phone. He looked about Chase's age. For a fleeting second, the image of my son's face, twisted with that ugly mercenary rage, flashed before my eyes. I felt a surge of nausea, a momentary return of the dead weight Talia had called me. But I pushed it down. I looked at the ledger. "I'll be waiting for you, Mrs. Hollowell," Carter said. "I'll pull the physical file now." I hung up and closed the folder with a sharp snap. The administrative hold was the first brick I laid in the wall of my defense. It was the digital equivalent of changing the locks, a way to freeze the ground beneath Chase's feet, before he could realize the earth was moving. He and Talia were likely at the house right now, measuring the windows for new curtains or dreaming of the granite that would be paid for by my husband's life insurance. They thought they had evicted a weak, grieving woman. They didn't realize they had declared war on an auditor. I stood up, squaring my shoulders. The morning light didn't feel so intrusive anymore. It felt like a spotlight on a battlefield. I looked at Henry's watch on my wrist. It was 9:42 a.m. Chase had the house. He had the physical walls and the roof that Henry had shingled with his own hands. But he didn't have the law. He didn't have the note. And most importantly, he didn't have the stomach for the kind of cold, calculated precision I was about to unleash. As I walked out of the Copper Cup, the chime of the door felt like a bell signaling the start of a new round. I wasn't just going to the bank. I was going to reclaim my life one line item at a time. Henry always said that numbers never lied. Today I was going to make sure they told the truth loud enough for the whole world to hear. The dead weight was about to become the anchor that pulled their fantasy into the deep. Elena Park's office was not a place for the faint of heart. Located in a refurbished textile mill where the brick was exposed and the windows stretched toward the sky like prayers, it was a sanctuary of logic and cold, hard light. There were no plush velvet chairs or bowls of mints here. Instead, there were stacks of case law bound in weathered leather, the scent of high-grade ink, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Elena sat behind a desk made of reclaimed oak, her dark hair pulled back into a knot so tight, it seemed to pull her features into a permanent expression of focused intensity. She was a woman who saw the world in shades of evidence and hearsay. We had been friends since our university days, I the one who mastered the spreadsheets and she the one who mastered the statutes. She didn't stand up to hug me when I walked in. She didn't offer me tea or ask me how I was holding up. She simply looked at me, her eyes tracking the faint, yellowish bruising along my jawline, and pointed to the chair across from her. "Sit na," she said. Her voice was like glass, transparent but capable of cutting to the bone. "I've reviewed the preliminary documents you emailed. Tell me about the slap. Leave out the grief. Give me the mechanics." I sat. For the first time since the funeral, the phantom heat on my cheek, the lingering burning echo of Chase's hand, began to cool. In the presence of Elena's surgical detachment, the trauma felt less like a wound and more like a data point. I described the evening, the stacking of the casserole dishes, the coldness in my son's eyes, the sudden violent rupture of the air, and the bellowing demand for me to vacate my own life. Elena listened, her fountain pen moving across a legal pad with a rhythmic scratching sound. When I finished, she capped the pen and looked up. There was no pity in her gaze. There was only a terrifying, focused clarity. "He thinks he's playing a game of blood," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "He thinks that because he shared Henry's DNA, he is the rightful heir to the kingdom. He is operating on sentiment and a primitive sense of entitlement. But we are not playing a game of blood, nah. We are playing a game of ink." She leaned forward, her hands interlaced on the oak. "The law has a language, and to those who don't speak it, it sounds like jargon. But to those who do, it is poetry. It is the music of consequences." She began to lay out the strategy, her words falling like gavel strikes. "First, we address the occupancy clause. Your mortgage contract specifically lists you and Henry as the sole authorized occupants. By forcing you out and moving himself in, Chase hasn't just been a bad son. He has created a technical default. He is a tenant at sufferance at best, and a trespasser at worst. I've already drafted a formal notice to the bank's legal department to supplement your meeting with Carter. We aren't just telling them there's a dispute. We are telling them their collateral is being compromised by an unauthorized third party." I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in weeks. A flicker of power. It was the auditor's thrill. The moment when you realize the discrepancy is large enough to sink the ship. "Then," Elena continued, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, "there is the matter of slander of title. You mentioned they brought a realtor in? That they are taking photos for a listing." I nodded, my mind flashing to the grainy photo Mrs. Alvarez had sent me. If Chase attempts to list that house, or even signs a preliminary agreement with a broker, he is asserting ownership he does not possess, Elena explained. "That is slander of title. It's a tort, nah. It means I can tie him up in litigation that will make his head spin. I will file a lease pendens, a notice of pending litigation, against the property. It will act like a digital padlock. No bank will touch a mortgage, no buyer will touch a contract, and no realtor will risk their license on a property with a clouded title. He wants to flip the house? I'll make sure he can't even paint a baseboard without a court order." I leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking beneath me. The image of Chase and Talia standing in my kitchen, imagining their stainless steel future, suddenly seemed pathetic. They were children playing with matches in a room made of paper, unaware that I was the one who held the water. "And the slap?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elena's expression hardened. "That is the emotional anchor of our elder abuse filing. North Carolina takes a dim view of adult children, using physical violence to facilitate financial gain from a parent. It's not just a domestic assault. It's a predicate for a civil no-contact order, and a freeze on all potential inheritance claims. We aren't just going to get you back into the house, nah. We are going to build a legal fortress around you that he can never breach again. She pushed a stack of papers toward me. Affidavits, petitions, and the formal cease and desist letter. I need your signature. Not as a grieving widow, but as the note holder. Picked up the pen. The weight of it felt substantial like a scepter. As I signed my name, Na Hollowell, I realized that Chase had made the ultimate tactical error. He had mistaken my silence for surrender and my grief for weakness. He had forgotten that for 40 years I was the one who kept the books. I was the one who knew where every cent was hidden and every liability was buried. He called me dead weight, Elena, I said as I handed the papers back. Elena tucked the documents into a folder, her movements precise and final. Then he's about to find out how heavy dead weight can be when it's dropped from a great height. I walked out of Elena's office and into the crisp afternoon air. The city felt different now. The noise of the traffic, the bustle of the crowds. It all seemed to follow a hidden set of rules, a system of checks and balances that I finally understood how to navigate. I was no longer a woman standing in the shadows of a funeral. I was a player on a board Chase didn't even know existed. He was playing a game of tantrums, I was playing a game of chess. And as I walked toward my car, the phantom heat on my cheek was gone, replaced by the cool, sharp clarity of the law. The note decides the story, Henry used to say. I looked up at the sun, squinting against the light. The note is in my hand now, Henry, I whispered. And the ending belongs to me. Next step for our story. The shadows in my motel room were long and thin, stretching across the cracked linoleum like the fingers of a pauper reaching for a warmth that wasn't there. I sat at the small, wobbly desk, the wood grain a cheap imitation of the solid, sturdy oak that waited for me back on Briarwood Lane. The buzzing of the neon sign outside had become a familiar, albeit irritating, companion, a rhythmic reminder that I was now a woman living in the margins, a temporary resident in a life I hadn't chosen. But as I sat there, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea from a styrofoam cup, my mind didn't stay within the confines of those four sterile walls. It drifted. It traveled through the cool night air, past the highway's roar, and settled softly into the house Henry and I had built. In the theater of my mind, the lights were on, the air was warm, and the betrayal was just beginning to ripen. I could almost hear the silence at my dining table, the table that was the true heart of our home. It wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a witness. It was where Henry had sat every Saturday morning, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, humming a low, tuneless melody as he sorted through the mail. It was where we had sat together side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we balanced the checkbooks. We treated those office hours with the reverence of a religious rite. To us, the ledger was a sacred text, a record of our stewardship over the life God had given us. We spoke in whispers of interest rates, insurance premiums, and the quiet pride of a decreasing principal. That table had seen the joy of Chase's first birthday cake, the crumbs of late-night study sessions, and the damp rings of my teacups after Henry passed. Now, I imagined it being desecrated. In my mind's eye, the room was bright, too bright. Talia would have turned on every light, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the wallpaper she so desperately wanted to tear down. I pictured her sitting in my chair, her spine straight with a predatory grace. Her laptop, a sleek silver machine that looked like a weapon, would be open on the oak surface. Her fingers, manicured and restless, would be twitching with a greed so concentrated it felt like a physical hum. Beside her, Chase would be pacing. I knew his pace. It was the restless, thumping stride of a man who was always looking for the next exit, the next shortcut, the next windfall. He would be holding a glass of Henry's expensive bourbon, the bottle I had saved for a special occasion that would never come. "Did you get in?" Chase would ask, his voice tight with an anticipation that bordered on feverish. "Almost," Talia would murmur, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Just navigating the portal. It's an old-school interface. Typical. Your mother probably hasn't updated the security in a decade." I leaned back in my motel chair, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. "Oh, Talia, you have no idea." I could see her typing. I could see the reflection of the bank's logo in the pupils of her eyes. She would be entering the login credentials she'd likely scavenged from the desk drawer where I kept my emergency notes. She thought she was a thief in the night, but she was merely a moth flying toward a flame I had ignited hours ago in that quiet cafe. "Here we go," she would say, her breath hitching. "Home equity line of credit. Available balance. 350,000. God, Chase, do you realize what we can do with this? We can gut the kitchen by Monday. Granite Sub-Zero fridge, the works. The staging alone will add 100 grand to the asking price." "Do it," Chase would urge, leaning over her shoulder. "Draw 50. We need the earnest money for the condo in the city anyway. This house is our ticket out of this suburban tomb." I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact moment her finger pressed the enter key. The digital request would scream through the fiber optic cables, racing toward the bank's central server. It would hit the wall I had built with Mr. Carter. It would trigger the administrative hold I had placed like a landmine. In my mind, the screen didn't refresh with a confirmation number. It didn't offer a digital thank you. Instead, the screen would blink. Once, twice, and then the text would appear, harsh crimson and final. "Transaction declined. Contact branch manager." The silence in my imagined kitchen would be sudden and absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. I pictured Talia's face, the way her jaw would drop, the way the triumph in her eyes would curdle into a confused, frantic fear. "What? No, that's not right," she would stammer, her fingers flying over the keys again. "It must be a glitch. An internet timeout. Try again," Chase would bark, his face reddening. "Refresh the page. Refresh. Declined. Refresh. Account restricted. Refresh. Unauthorized access detected." I sat in my dark motel room, the styrofoam cup cold in my hand, and I felt the first real taste of the winter I was bringing to their doorstep. It wasn't a winter of ice and snow, but a winter of accountability, the cold, hard reality of a world that didn't care about their dream or their inheritance. They thought they had discarded a broken woman. They thought they had evicted a victim. But as they sat at my sacred table, staring at a screen that refused to obey them, they were finally meeting the auditor. They were realizing that the dead weight they had pushed out the door was actually the only person who knew how to keep the lights on. I imagined Chase's frustration boiling over, the way he would slam his hand against the oak table, the table Henry had sanded until it was as smooth as silk. I felt a pang of sorrow for the wood, for the house, for the memories they were trampling. But the sorrow was encased in a shell of iron resolve. "She did something," Talia would hiss, her voice realizing the truth before Chase's could. "The old woman. She's frozen the accounts. She can't." Chase would roar, his voice echoing in the empty hallway where my coat used to hang. "She's a widow. She's in shock. She doesn't even know how to use a smartphone half the time." I opened my eyes and looked at my phone on the motel desk. The blue light was steady. I was 64 years old, but I was a master of the ledger. I knew every cent, every decimal, and every digital safeguard. Chase had spent his life underestimating me, seeing only the mother who baked cookies and folded laundry. He had never seen the woman who stared down corporate boards and found the missing millions in the dark. The realization that their renovation fund was a mirage would be the first of many shocks. They had planned to strip my home of its soul and sell the shell for a profit. They had planned to build their future on the ruins of my past. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of the game. You cannot draw from an account that isn't yours. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just an inch. The neon sign was still buzzing, a restless electric ghost in the night. "The note decides the story, Henry," I whispered into the glass. I could almost hear the wind howling around the eaves of our house, a cold, mournful sound. The winter had arrived on Briarwood Lane. And while Chase and Talia huddled around a glowing screen that offered them nothing but red ink, I was finally beginning to feel the warmth of my own fire. I was the note holder, and the audit had only just begun. The fluorescent light in the motel bathroom hummed with a low, headache-inducing frequency, casting a flickering, sickly pallor over everything it touched. It was the kind of light designed to discourage lingering, the kind that turned skin to parchment and shadows to ink. I stood before the small, pitted mirror above the laminate sink, my breath hitching as I finally forced myself to really look. For days I had felt the heat, the throbbing pulse of the injury, but I had avoided the reflection. I had lived in the periphery of my own body, moving through the motions of survival like a ghost in a machine. But today the auditor required documentation. Today, the mother had to step aside so the witness could take the stand. The bruise on my left cheek had matured into a grotesque, variegated map of betrayal. What had started as a hot crimson brand was now a sickly shade of violet, edged with a jaundiced yellow and a deep, muddy plum at the center, the exact point where his knuckles had met my bone. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, a signature written in broken capillaries. As I traced the swollen ridge of my jawline, I didn't feel the sting of the physical pain. I felt the absolute, chilling silence of a dead relationship. I reached for my phone, my movements slow and deliberate. My hands, usually so steady when navigating the complex columns of a tax return, had a minute, persistent tremor. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and lifted the device. Click. The sound was tiny, a digital shutter snapping shut, but in the sterile quiet of the bathroom, it sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Click. A profile shot. Click. A close-up of the discoloration. I stared at the images on the screen. This wasn't just a bruise. It was a forensic record of the moment my son ceased to be my child and became my assailant. It was a supporting document for the most painful audit of my life. I walked back into the main room, where the pink neon sign outside was already beginning its evening dance against the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under the weight of my resolve, and opened my voice memo app. My phone had been buzzing intermittently for the last hour, a staccato rhythm of desperation. Chase. I hadn't answered, but I had let the calls go to voicemail, and I had recorded the live transcripts where I could. Now I hit play on the latest message. Mom, pick up the damn phone. Chase's voice exploded into the room, jagged and raw, stripped of even the thinnest veneer of filial respect. What did you do to the Hellick? Talia is at the bank and they're treating her like a criminal. Fix it now, Mom. I mean it. This house is falling apart and we need that equity for the contractors. You're being spiteful and it's pathetic. Call the manager and release the hold or so help me. The recording cut off with a sharp, aggressive click. I sat in the dim light, the silence rushing back in to fill the space his rage had vacated. There was no "I'm sorry." There was no "Are you okay?" There was only the ugly, naked entitlement of a man who viewed his mother as nothing more than a malfunctioning ATM. He didn't want my forgiveness. He wanted my compliance. He didn't miss me. He missed the gold mine I represented. I selected the file, renamed it with a clinical precision that felt like a shield, and saved it into a secure cloud folder. File name: Exhibit Audio Evidence, March 9, 2026. In the world of accounting, every entry in the ledger must have a corresponding piece of evidence. You cannot claim a loss without a receipt. You cannot verify an asset without a deed. And in the ledger of our relationship, the debt Chase owed me was now far beyond his ability to pay. The balance had shifted into an irredeemable deficit. I began to compile the rest of the exhibits. I scanned the text messages from Talia, veiled threats disguised as concern for my mental health, suggestions that I was confused and unstable. I added the photos of the moving boxes they had packed while I was still at the funeral, the items of Henry's that they had already marked for yard sale. Every file I uploaded felt like a stone being added to a wall. I was building a fortress, not of brick and mortar, but of facts and dates. Chase thought he was fighting a grieving, elderly woman who would eventually crumble under the weight of her own loneliness. He didn't realize that I was a woman who had spent 40 years finding the truth hidden in the lies of men much smarter and more dangerous than him. The emotional toll was a separate account, one that I wasn't quite ready to reconcile. Every time I heard his voice on those recordings, a part of me, the part that still remembered the smell of his baby hair and the weight of his small hand in mine, wanted to howl. I wanted to scream at the universe. How did we get here? Where did I fail? But the auditor wouldn't allow it. Not yet. Emotions are volatile, nah, Henry used to say when I'd get upset over a client's dishonesty. But the numbers, they're the only thing that stays the same when the wind changes. I looked at the exhibit of photo one last time before locking the phone. The bruise was ugly, yes, but it was also a revelation. It had stripped away the last of my illusions. It had shown me that the son I was mourning had died long before Henry did. He had been replaced by a predator who wore my son's face. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the traffic on the highway. The headlights looked like a stream of data points, moving toward a destination I couldn't see. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I wasn't just a dead weight to be discarded. I was a counterparty. I was a litigant. I was the note holder. The night before, I had been a victim fleeing in the dark. Tonight, as I looked at the neatly organized files in my digital vault, I felt a strange, cold peace. The audit was officially underway, and Chase was about to find out that when you strike the person who keeps the books, you eventually have to account for every single bruise. I picked up the motel notepad and wrote one thing at the top of the page, my handwriting elegant and firm. Reconciliation plan. Phase 1. The debt was high, the interest was accruing, and I was coming to collect. The morning air was crisp, tasting of frost and the faint biting scent of pine, a sharpness that matched the edge of my resolve. I sat in my car, parked half a block away from the house on Briarwood Lane, tucked behind the sprawling branches of an ancient weeping willow. From this vantage point, I was a ghost haunting the perimeter of my own life. I watched the neighborhood wake up, the joggers with their rhythmic footfalls, the school buses with their mechanical groans, all while my own world hung in a state of suspended animation. I checked my watch. 10:01 am. Precision was the hallmark of a good audit, and Mr. Henderson, the bank's field inspector, was nothing if not precise. A modest white sedan, bearing the discreet blue logo of the lender on its door, rounded the corner and pulled into my driveway. It didn't roar. It arrived with the quiet, bureaucratic inevitability of a tax bill. I saw the front door of my house, swing open before the engine had even cut out. Chase stepped onto the porch. Even from this distance, his posture was a caricature of authority. He stood with his feet planted wide, his chest puffed out with the false bravado of a king who had climbed onto a throne made of stolen wood. He was wearing one of Henry's old cashmere sweaters, a garment that had always looked dignified on my husband but looked like a costume on my son. Beside him, Talia appeared, her hand resting lightly on the railing, as if she were surveying a kingdom she had already conquered. She was smiling, that sharp, practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, the one she used when she was trying to charm a waiter or a potential investor. They thought this was a victory lap. They thought the bank was here to help them unlock the gold mine they had spent the last 48 hours dreaming about. They had no deed, no power of attorney, and no signature authority. They had only a hollow sense of mine, a belief that blood outweighed the law. I watched as Mr. Henderson stepped out of the sedan. He was a small, wiry man with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that looked like they had seen every trick in the book. He carried a heavy, weathered clipboard and a digital camera strapped to his neck. He didn't offer a handshake, he offered a professional nod. "I'm the owner." I could almost hear Chase's voice carrying on the wind, loud and arrogant. "My father passed, and we're looking to get the equity line moving for some urgent structural improvements. Glad you're here." Mr. Henderson didn't smile back. He didn't even look at Chase's face. He looked at the house. He looked at the roofline, the windows, and the foundation. To Chase, this was a prize. To the inspector, this was collateral asset #422B. I watched as they disappeared inside. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I imagined them walking through my foyer, past the spot where Henry's shoes used to sit. I pictured Mr. Henderson's clinical gaze falling upon the boxes stacked in the hallway, the boxes Chase and Talia had filled with my memories while the dirt on Henry's grave was still fresh. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, my breath hitching. They are treating my life like a liquidation sale, I thought. Every note Henderson took on that clipboard was a nail in the coffin of Chase's fantasy. Every photo he snapped was a record of their unauthorized occupation. Inside those walls, the reality of my legal padlock was about to hit them with the force of a tidal wave. I knew the script Henderson would follow. He would ask for the borrower of record. He would ask for the documentation of the transfer of title. And when Chase produced nothing but excuses and family trees, Henderson would refer to the administrative hold I had placed like a digital barricade across the entrance. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The neighborhood remained indifferent to the execution taking place inside 422 Briarwood. Suddenly, the front door flew open again. Chase practically tumbled onto the porch, his face no longer flushed with bravado, but with a dark, panicked purple. He was waving his arms, his voice now a ragged, frantic bellow that I could hear clearly even with my windows rolled up. What do you mean restricted? This is my father's house. I'm his only son. You can't tell me I don't have access to the equity. Mr. Henderson followed him out, his pace slow and measured. He didn't look flustered. He looked bored. He had dealt with 1,000 chases in his career. Men who thought their emotions could override a binding contract. He stopped on the top step, his clipboard tucked under his arm. As I stated, Mr. Hollowell, Henderson's voice was a calm drone, the borrower, Na Hollowell, has placed an administrative freeze on all accounts related to this collateral. Until she physically appears at the branch and signs the release, this property is in a state of suspended status. No draws, no sales, no modifications. She's my mother. Chase screamed, his hands shaking. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's grief-stricken. She's not stable. Talia stepped out behind him, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't scream. She hissed something to the inspector, her eyes darting toward the street, perhaps sensing that the ground was no longer solid beneath her feet. The bank does not adjudicate family stability, Henderson replied, walking toward his sedan. We follow the note. And the note is in the name of Na Hollowell. If you are occupying the premises without the borrower's consent, that is a matter for the civil courts. Good day. I watched as the white sedan pulled away, leaving Chase and Talia standing on the porch like shipwreck survivors. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating weight that seemed to press down on the entire street. Chase kicked the railing Henry had sanded and stained with such care. He looked small. He looked like the boy who used to throw tantrums when he didn't get the toy he wanted, except now he was a man trying to steal a house. I felt a strange, hollowed-out sadness for him. I had spent 26 years trying to build a foundation for him, and here he was trying to burn it down because he couldn't have it all right now. But beneath the sadness was the auditor's satisfaction. The numbers had been crunched. The assets had been protected. The dead weight had proven to be the only thing holding the entire structure together. My house was being appraised, but not for the sale they envisioned. It was being appraised for reclamation. It was being documented as a site of a crime, not just a crime of property but a crime of the heart. I started my car, the engine purring softly. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw Chase look toward the street. For a split second, I wondered if he saw the glint of my windshield, if he felt the presence of the mother he had discarded. But I didn't stop. I had more calls to make. I had more ink to spill. The note is the truth, Chase, I whispered, my voice steady as I turned the corner. And the truth is, you're just a guest who stayed too long. I drove toward the bank, the weight of Henry's folder on the passenger seat feeling like a shield. The verdict was in. The house wasn't a gold mine for them. It was a fortress for me. And I was finally coming home to claim it. The conference room at the bank was a box of clinical transparency. Its walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the bustling lobby below. A choreographed ballet of deposits, withdrawals, and small talk. But inside the room, the atmosphere was pressurized, sterile, and smelled faintly of fresh toner and the metallic tang of high-stakes decisions. It was a room designed for clarity, a place where ambiguities were stripped away until only the cold, hard skeleton of the truth remained. I sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, my back straight, my hands folded atop Henry's leather folder. On my wrist, his watch ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty, a tiny metronome of justice. I had dressed with deliberate care in a charcoal suit, my silver hair swept back, my face a mask of practiced composure. The bruise on my cheek was still there, a fading map of violet and yellow, but I had chosen not to hide it with makeup today. I wanted it to be seen. I wanted it to be the silent witness in the room. Chase and Talia sat across from me. Chase was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture of aggressive defiance. He still wore that sneer, that ugly, curled lip expression of a man who believed his birthright outweighed his behavior. Talia sat beside him, her fingers drumming a restless, syncopated beat on the table. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a crack in the glass, a loophole in the light. Mr. Carter, the branch manager, sat at the foot of the table. He opened a thick manila file, his movements slow and deliberate. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was the only noise in the room for a long, agonizing minute. "We are here," Mr. Carter began, his voice devoid of any personal heat, "to resolve the status of the property at 422 Briarwood Lane and the associated accounts. Mr. Hollowell, you have made several inquiries regarding the home equity line and the transfer of deed. Mrs. Hollowell, you have placed a formal administrative hold on these assets." "It's a simple matter of inheritance," Chase interrupted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "My father is gone. I'm the next of kin. My mother is clearly overwhelmed by the process. We're just trying to protect the asset from her own confusion." He looked at me then, his eyes flickering with a momentary flash of the boy I used to tuck into bed, but it was quickly eclipsed by the shadow of the predator he had become. Mr. Carter didn't look up from the file. "The bank does not operate on the basis of next of kin until a probate court issues a decree. However, we do operate on the basis of the note. And the note, the legal promise to pay, is a contract between this institution and the borrowers." He turned a page, the sound like a dry cough. "The note belongs to your mother, Mr. Hollowell. Exclusively. She is the surviving borrower of record. Henry Hollowell's interests passed to her automatically upon his death. You, sir, have no signature authority. You have no draw rights. And according to the occupancy clause, you have no legal right to reside in the collateral without the express, written consent of the borrower." I watched the sneer on Chase's face begin to wither. It didn't disappear all at once. It shriveled at the edges, his mouth going slack as the weight of the manager's words began to sink in. "But I'm his son," Chase stammered, his bravado beginning to leak like a punctured tire. "You're telling me she can just lock me out of my own father's house?" "It is not your house," I said. My voice was low, steady, a terrifying contrast to his rising panic. "It was never your house, Chase. You were a guest in a home built by a man you didn't respect enough to mourn." "Mom, stop it," he snapped, turning his rage toward me. "You're ruining this family. You're being spiteful because you can't handle the fact that things are changing. You're destroying everything Dad worked for." "On the contrary," Mr. Carter interjected, his tone hardening, "the bank's field inspection report, filed yesterday, indicates that you and your wife have been preparing the property for an unauthorized sale. You've brought in realtors, you've packed the borrower's belongings, and you've attempted to draw $50,000 from an equity line you do not own. In the eyes of this bank, that is not protecting the asset. That is a breach of contract. And potentially it is fraud." Talia's face drained of color. She stopped drumming her fingers and gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned a porcelain white. "We were just trying to increase the value," she whispered, her voice stripped of its poisonous silk. "We thought. You thought I was weak." I cut her off. I reached into my folder and pulled out a stack of high-gloss photographs. I slid them across the polished wood, fanning them out like a deck of cards. The images were stark, unforgiving. Close-ups of the bruise on my face. A photo of the suitcases they had thrown onto the porch. A copy of the text message Chase had sent at 2 a.m. "Fix it now or you'll regret it." "This," I said, pointing to the photo of my own bruised jaw, "is Exhibit A. This is the care you showed me after I buried my husband. This is the protection you offered the woman who gave you everything." Chase looked at the photo, then looked away, his jaw clenching. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Mr. Hollowell," Carter said, his voice now sounding like a final verdict. "Because of the breach of the occupancy clause and the documented dispute, the bank is issuing a formal demand. You and your wife have 72 hours to vacate the premises. If the house is not broom swept and the keys returned to your mother by noon on Friday, we will initiate a forced eviction in conjunction with the sheriff's office. Furthermore, your mother has directed us to flag your social security numbers for any further attempts to access her accounts." 72 hours. The words hit Chase like a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, the reality of his situation finally shattering the glass house of his ego. He looked small. He looked defeated. He looked like the stranger he had become. "You're really doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You're throwing your own son out on the street?" I leaned forward, my heart a heavy stone in my chest, but my mind as clear as the glass walls around us. I felt the weight of 40 years of motherhood, of every sacrifice, every prayer, and every quiet yes I had given him. I am not throwing you out, Chase, I said softly. I am simply reclaiming the ground you thought you could steal. You didn't just strike me, you struck the memory of your father. You tried to liquidate my life while the scent of funeral lilies was still on my clothes. I stood up, closing Henry's folder with a sharp final thud. You mistook my kindness for weakness, I told him, looking him straight in the eye until he was forced to blink. You thought that because I loved you I wouldn't hold you accountable. You forgot that before I was your mother I was an auditor. And I have spent my life ensuring that every debt is paid in full. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stone floor. As I reached the glass wall I paused and looked back at them, two people sitting in the ruins of a dream they hadn't earned. The 72 hours starts now, I said. I walked out of the conference room and into the bright, busy lobby. The air felt different, thinner, colder, but finally clean. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The summit was over. The dawn of the 72nd hour arrived not with a trumpet blast of victory, but with a cold gray drizzle that turned the world the color of wet slate. I stood half hidden behind the thick trunk of the weeping willow at the edge of Mrs. Alvarez's property, a silent sentinel in the shadows of my own neighborhood. The air was biting, a damp chill that seeped through my wool coat and settled into my bones, but I didn't move. I needed to witness the finality of it. I needed to see the physical manifestation of the audit I had set in motion. In my driveway sat a dented orange and white U-Haul truck, its engine idling with a rhythmic mechanical cough that sounded like a dying beast. The back ramp was down, a tongue of corrugated metal licking the asphalt. I watched as Chase emerged from the front door, hauling a stack of plastic bins. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, stripped of the arrogant swagger that had defined him just days ago. He looked smaller in the dim light, his shoulders hunched against the rain, his hair matted and unkempt. Beside him Talia followed, her face a mask of pinched, silent fury. She carried her designer suitcases with a grip so tight her knuckles were white, tossing them into the dark cavern of the truck with a reckless disregard for their contents. There was no glory in the sight. No surge of triumph warmed my chest as I watched my only child be evicted from the home I had nurtured him in. Instead, there was only a profound, aching sadness, a hollowed-out grief that was far heavier than the mourning I felt for Henry. Henry was gone, but he was still whole in my memory. Chase was still here, but the boy I had raised, the boy who used to hide behind my legs and ask me to read him stories about brave knights, had disappeared, replaced by this bitter, hollowed-out man. I closed my eyes for a second, the image of his 5-year-old self vivid in my mind, clutching a wooden train set and smiling with a gap-toothed grin. Where did that boy go? I wondered. In which ledger did I fail to record the creeping debt of his entitlement? I opened my eyes just in time to see Chase stop at the threshold of the garage. He looked around, his gaze darting toward the workbench Henry had built. I saw him reach out and snag something small from the pegboard, Henry's old tape measure. It was a relic of 1,000 projects, its yellow casing faded and cracked, the spring-back mechanism sluggish from years of honest labor. It was a final petty theft, a desperate attempt to salvage a piece of the kingdom he had failed to conquer. My first instinct was to step out of the shadows, to shout, to demand the return of that small sacred object. It was Henry's. It belonged to the house. But I stayed my feet. I forced my hands to stay deep in my pockets. Let him have it, I thought, a bitter lump forming in my throat. He could have the tool, but he would never understand the craftsmanship of the man who owned it. He could steal the measure, but he would never be able to measure up to the integrity of the father he had betrayed. I had the house. I had the foundation. He had a piece of plastic and a heart full of ash. Is that everything? Talia's voice drifted across the damp air, sharp and impatient. Yeah, Chase grunted, his voice sounding raw. Let's just go. This place is cursed anyway. He slammed the rolling door of the U-Haul shut. The sound was a thunderclap, a violent punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look at the windows where his childhood height had been marked in pencil on the doorframe. He climbed into the cab, the engine roared with a final smoky protest, and the truck began to pull away. I watched the taillights fade into the gray mist of the morning, watching the U-Haul disappear around the corner, taking his anger, Talia's greed, and the wreckage of our family with it. The silence that followed was absolute. I stepped out from behind the willow tree, my boots squelching in the mud. I walked up my driveway, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the front door and pulled the new set of keys from my pocket. The brass felt cold and heavy in my hand, a symbol of a victory that felt remarkably like a loss. I turned the lock. The click was clean, precise, and final. I stepped inside. The house was empty, stripped of the life that had occupied it for the last week. It smelled of stale coffee and the lingering sour scent of Chase's cigarettes, a scent Henry would have never allowed. Boxes of my things were still stacked in the hallway, some of them torn open where Talia had searched for valuables to liquidate. I walked into the kitchen and stood by the island. The granite was cold beneath my palms. I looked at the spot where Chase had struck me, the memory of the heat still ghosting over my skin. I was alone. The auditor had finished the count, the assets were secured, and the unauthorized occupants were gone. But as I looked at the quiet, shadowed rooms of my home, I realized that reclaiming the house was the easy part. The hard part would be living in the silence they left behind. I walked to the window and watched the rain wash the dust from the driveway. My house was mine again. The note was in my hand. But the boy I loved was gone, and no amount of legal precision could bring him back. I drew a long, shaky breath, the scent of the house, my house, slowly beginning to return. I reached out and touched the frame of the wedding photo Talia had shoved into a corner. I straightened it. The audit was over. The reconciliation was just beginning. How I can help you next? The silence of the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a heavy, bruised thing that hung in the corners of the rooms like stagnant smoke. As I stepped over the threshold, the air felt thick with the residue of a week-long invasion. It smelled of dust, of the bitter chemical tang of Talia's hairspray, and the lingering ghost of Chase's shouts, echoes that seemed to vibrate within the very drywall. It was a house that had been treated as merchandise, and it felt as violated as I did. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't sit down. I stood in the foyer, my heart hammering a slow, rhythmic cadence against my ribs. I felt like an intruder in my own history, a ghost wandering through a life that had been packed into boxes and marked for liquidation. My first call wasn't to a friend or to Elena. It was to a locksmith. He arrived within 30 minutes. A man with tired eyes and a heavy belt of tools that clinked like armor. He didn't ask questions about why a woman in a black morning dress needed every lock in her house replaced on a Tuesday morning. He simply worked. I followed him from door to door, watching the silver mechanisms fall away, replaced by reinforced steel. When he reached the back door, the one Chase had slammed so violently that the frame had splintered, he paused. He looked at the damage, then at the fading bruise on my jaw, and his expression softened into a quiet, masculine understanding. "I'll reinforce the strike plate, ma'am," he said softly. "Nobody's getting through this one without a battering ram." When he finished, he handed me a heavy ring of brass keys. I walked him to his truck, and as I returned to the porch, I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I turned the key in the front door and listened. Snick. The sound was sharp, metallic, and absolute. It was the sound of a border being drawn. It was the sound of my first peaceful breath in 7 days. The dead weight had officially secured the gates. But the locks were only the beginning. The house required an exorcism. I went to the kitchen first, the site of the slap, the epicenter of the betrayal. I pulled a bucket of hot water and a bottle of bleach from the pantry. I stripped the floor on my hands and knees, scrubbing until the skin of my palms was raw and the air was sharp with the scent of purification. I washed away the fingerprints of greed from the granite counters. I scrubbed the stove where Talia had let soup boil over, leaving a charred, neglected mess. I scoured the dining table, the sacred oak where Henry and I had balanced our lives, until the wood shone with a defiant luster. By the time the sun began to dip behind the oak trees, my body was aching with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But the auditor in me wasn't finished. I went to the local hardware store and stood before the wall of paint swatches. My eyes landed on a soft, muted green, a color that looked like the first breath of spring in the Appalachian foothills. Carolina sage, the label read. It was the color Henry had once mentioned in passing years ago, when we were hiking near the Blue Ridge. That green he had said, pointing to the moss on a shaded stone. It looks like peace, doesn't it? I bought 3 gallons and a set of professional brushes. I spent the next 2 days in a trance of labor. I taped the edges of the kitchen cabinets with a surgeon's precision. I laid down drop cloths like shrouds over the furniture. And then I began to paint. The first stroke of Carolina sage felt like an act of atonement. I painted over the wall where Chase's shadow had loomed as he bellowed for me to leave. I painted over the spot where I had slumped against the counter, my face burning with the sting of his hand. With every rhythmic pass of the roller, I was burying the trauma beneath layers of renewal. I was reclaiming the walls that had witnessed my humiliation and turning them into the boundaries of my sanctuary. The physical labor was a meditation. My shoulders burned and my neck throbbed, but with every gallon of paint, the lingering ghosts began to fade. The house was no longer a site of a crime. It was becoming a garden. On the 3rd evening, as the paint dried into a velvety, calming green, I went to the hallway. There, shoved behind a stack of empty boxes, I found our wedding photo. The glass was smudged with dust, and the frame had a small chip in the corner where it had been dropped. I took it to the sink and cleaned it with a soft cloth. I stared at the 2 young people in the photograph, Henry with his thick, dark hair and a nervous, triumphant grin, and me in a lace veil, looking at him as if he were the sun. We were so sure of the world then. We had no idea that the child we would raise with such hope would one day become the storm that tried to blow our house down. I took the photo back to the living room and hung it on the central nail, exactly where it belonged. I straightened it until it was perfectly level. I stood back, my hands stained with sage-colored paint, and looked around. The house didn't smell like bleach or dust anymore. It smelled of wet paint and the faint, sweet scent of the tea I had finally allowed myself to brew. I walked to the kitchen and stood in the center of the room. The green walls seemed to hold the light of the setting sun, glowing with a soft, ethereal warmth. I realized then that I wasn't just cleaning a house. I was performing a liturgical act. I was scrubbing the shame out of the floorboards. I was painting the peace back into the air. I was reclaiming the narrative of my own life from the people who had tried to edit me out of it. That night, for the first time since Henry's heart stopped, I didn't sleep in the guest room or on the sofa. I went into our master bedroom. The sheets were fresh, smelling of lavender and the sun-dried wind. I lay down in the center of the bed, stretching my limbs into the space that belonged to me. Outside, the wind whispered through the oaks, a soft hushing sound that didn't feel like a threat. The new locks held the world at bay. The Carolina sage walls held the memories of the man I loved. And the note, the legal, immutable truth of my ownership, lay on the nightstand like a silent guardian. I closed my eyes, and as sleep finally pulled me under, I didn't see Chase's angry face or hear his bellowing voice. I saw Henry standing on the porch of a house that was finally truly a home. The exorcism was complete. The dead weight was finally light enough to fly. The morning arrived with a softness that felt like a forgiveness. April had finally come to Dilworth, and with it, the azaleas had exploded into a riot of defiant pinks and pristine whites, clustering around the foundation of my house like a floral guard. The air no longer tasted of the metallic chill of winter or the stagnant dust of betrayal. It smelled of damp earth, blooming life, and the sweet, lingering scent of the Carolina sage paint that had now fully cured on my kitchen walls. I sat on my porch swing, the rhythmic creak hush of the chains providing a soothing counterpoint to the morning birdsong. On my wrist, Henry's watch ticked, a steady mechanical metronome of survival. For 40 years, I had lived my life in the shadow of other people's needs. A quiet moon reflecting the light of my husband's strength and my son's demands. But as I watched the sunlight filter through the oak leaves, I realized the reflection had ended. I was finally generating my own light. The mail carrier, a young woman who always offered a kind wave, walked up the path and slid a few envelopes into the box. I waited, allowing the swing to settle, before walking down the steps to retrieve them. Among the utility bills and the bank statements lay a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, hurried, messy, the letters leaning forward with an impatient, sloping entitlement. Chase. I took the mail back to the porch and sat down. My heart didn't gallop, my breath didn't catch. The auditor in me was simply observing a new entry in a closed account. I opened the letter with a silver opener Henry had given me for our 10th anniversary. The words spilled out across the page, a frantic mixture of half-hearted apologies and desperate pleas. Mom, I know things got heated. Talia and I are in a real spot. The condo deposit fell through because the bank flagged our credit. If you could just lend us a little from the equity, just for a few months, we could get back on our feet. You're destroying my future, Mom. I read it once, my eyes scanning the lines with a clinical detachment. I looked for the word sorry for the slap. It wasn't there. I looked for an inquiry about my health or my grief. It was absent. The letter was a balance sheet of his own making, filled with liabilities he wanted me to cover and assets he still believed he could claim. I didn't burn the letter. I didn't cry over the ink. I didn't feel the urge to pick up the phone and rescue the boy who had tried to drown me. To do so would be to invalidate the audit I had so painfully completed. I walked inside, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood, and went to the office. I pulled out a heavy navy blue accordion folder. I had labeled it in clear, elegant script, Boundaries. I tucked Chase's letter inside, behind the police report and the cease and desist order. I closed the latch with a firm, decisive click. Then I climbed the small stepladder and placed the folder on the very top shelf of the floor-to-ceiling cabinets, a place where it was preserved, documented, but entirely out of my daily reach. The debt is recorded, Chase, I whispered to the empty room. But the credit is exhausted. That afternoon, I drove to the city center, to a small sun-drenched office of a housing nonprofit I had discovered during my weeks in the motel. The director, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and silver hair much like mine, met me with a firm handshake. Mrs. Hollowell, she said, ushering me into a room where a small group of seniors sat around a table. We are so grateful you're here. I took my seat at the head of the table. I had brought my laptop and a stack of simplified brochures I had designed myself. For the next 2 hours, I didn't talk about my grief or the son who had broken my heart. Instead, I talked about occupancy clauses, surviving borrower rights, and the architecture of the note. I watched the faces of the women and men in the room, people who looked like they had spent their lives building sanctuaries only to find the walls crumbling under the weight of predatory family members or financial confusion. I saw their eyes light up as I handed them the tools to protect themselves. I taught them that paper was a shield, that a signature was a boundary, and that being a parent didn't mean being a casualty of someone else's greed. In Henry's name, I had donated a significant portion of his life insurance to fund this program. It was a way of making his legacy immortal, of ensuring that the integrity he lived by would become a fortress for others. As I spoke, I felt a new kind of warmth spreading through me. Not the heat of anger or the burn of a slap, but the steady glowing coal of purpose. I wasn't just an accountant anymore. I was a guardian of legacies. When I returned home that evening, the sun was sinking low, casting long golden fingers across the Carolina sage walls of my kitchen. I moved through the house with a quiet grace, preparing a simple dinner for one. I used the good china. I lit a beeswax candle. I sat at the oak table, the table that had seen 40 years of life, and I didn't feel the dead weight of loneliness. I felt the profound, luminous weight of peace. I looked at the wedding photo on the wall. Henry looked back at me, his eyes full of that eternal, quiet support. I realized then that the audit was finally complete. I had accounted for the loss of my husband and reconciled the betrayal of my son. I had inventoried the damage and found that the structure was still sound. I reached out and touched the cool metal of the watch on my wrist. Tick, tick, tick. I had lost the boy I raised, yes. I had lost the partner who walked beside me. But in the wreckage of those losses, I had found something I hadn't known I was missing. I had found the woman who sat behind the spreadsheets. I had found the woman who knew how to hold the line. I walked out onto the porch one last time before bed. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights flickering on like distant stars. My house stood tall, a silhouette of strength against the darkening sky. It was no longer a gold mine or a merchandise to be flipped. It was a sanctuary, and I was its keeper. I drew in a deep, clean breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without the scent of lilies or bleach. I smiled, not with the fragile hope of the past, but with the steel-reinforced joy of the present. I was the note holder. I was the architect of my own peace. And as I turned to go inside, locking the door with a final melodic snick, I knew that the ending of the story didn't belong to the son who left, but to the mother who stayed. I had finally found the woman who held the note to her own soul. And she was more than enough. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with Emily until the very last tick of the clock. Stories like this remind us that our dignity is worth protecting, no matter the cost. Which moment in this story made your heart stir the most? Was it the sting of the betrayal, or the peace of the Carolina sage walls? I would be truly humbled to read your reflections in the comments below. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge to join our community of resilience. Your support means the world to me.